Thanks for the generous introduction. I know a lot of you are wondering how a sociologist gets to be a member of the Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care. It turns out I have a remarkable ability to transform or to turn rooms of 18 to 22-year-olds. The sound of my voice puts them to sleep. And so far as we know, there aren't the complications of other forms of anesthesia. I have nothing to disclaim other than I'm not going to talk about engagement. I thought I was when I was asked to speak. I'm actually going to talk more about what I think is a sloppiness and a looseness in speaking about systems. Speaking about learning health systems is a kind of horse I've been riding since the IOM report. I'm just going to shift some of the words I usually use when we talk about mistakes to now talking about learning. I have, by way of introduction, spent the last 5 years, or between 2011 and 2015, on an ARC-funded, as the ethnographer on an ARC-funded attempt to reduce surgical complications in 37 states, 2 countries, and 200 and some hospitals. That would seem to me to be a large effort at both quality improvement and learning, and it did not, well, it didn't, how shall I say, revitalize my faith in either systems or learning. Let's start with the National Academy of Medicine's definition. A learning health system is one in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned with continuous improvement and innovation, with best practices seamlessly embedded in the delivery process and new knowledge captured as an integral byproduct of the delivery experience. I think another way of saying that is that learning health systems are mythical beasts that apply best practices when they're known, their best guesses when they are not, and their best efforts to resolve uncertainty through sound clinical science. Problem being that we're not really sure what the rules for sound clinical science are, as we learned from the support study. A learning health system needs to keep inventing new sciences and bringing on new experts just to keep learning. I've often wondered, why do we need implementation science? I mean, exactly what is implementation science, and why isn't it actually implementation practice? Why do we need translational science? Don't people read the journals? And I mean, why do they need somebody to translate the journals? What in general is the place of organizational science, and who created it, and what makes you an expert in it? How is cognitive science at the individual level connected to organizational behavior at, I dare say, the organizational level? What kinds of experts does a learning health system need? What other sciences will we need to create? And why is it that we confuse data with information and transmission with communication? This is the wrong, I actually fixed that typo last night. So God knows what else is up here. But it does seem to me that whenever I hear somebody say to me in a learning health system, we just have too much data and we don't know where to even start to make sense of it, it seems to me that somebody hasn't asked the first question, which is, what kind of information do we need to make sound decisions? Not what kind of, and then we'll get the data from that. We rather gather the data and then say, well, what kind of questions can we ask, or what kinds of information do we have here? That's backwards. Of course, the lessons that experience teaches are open to interpretation. But when I thought I had longer than 15 minutes, I was going to play a clip here from Leonard Cohen singing the Sisters of Mercy with a keyed to McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where it isolates the story of, for those of you that haven't seen the movie, of the cowboy played by Keith Carradine and the punk that shoots them as he's walking across a bridge, where each have learned two very different systems. Each have been in the same system. Each have learned two very different lessons about behavior in that system. So there's a difference between, and I find this twice a year at least, every time I grade papers, there is a very large gap between what I think I have taught to my students and what they tell me they have learned. And there's no reason not to expect that in a learning health system as well. So can we provide the best technical care? And then is the best technical care, and this is the quote from the Sisters of Mercy, does the best technical care bind you with love that's graceful and green at the stem? How do you teach a system to be human? If to err is human, then it follows that a system that is error-free, and I use that term to evoke the recent election, is no longer human. I think there's something quixotic and contradictory, and perhaps nobly so, in trying to create a patient-centered delivery system that reduces preventable adverse events, provides for shared decision-making, and does that through impersonal, objective processes that treats each patient the same. And it also follows for me that some preventable adverse events are actually the result of honoring patient preferences. So do we agree on what lessons a learning health system needs to learn in order to teach people in it to learn? We base decisions on the best available evidence, but it seems to me that it's important to recognize that the best available evidence is not the same thing as adequate evidence. Sometimes the problem is the absence of a randomized clinical trial. Here we can look at the problems with hormone replacement therapy, but sometimes the problem is an excessive appropriation of a poorly conducted randomized clinical trial. And I did a paper on the preoperative beta blockades, a top 2 in 2002 recommendation from ARC as a patient safety measure based on a single clinical trial that, in my mind, A, should never have been approved by its IRB. It didn't use an intent to treat design, exposed patients to excessive risk because it randomized patients already on propranolol to the control arm where they didn't get the propranolol, then should never have been accepted by the New England Journal of Medicine because it didn't follow its statistical guidelines, then was adopted by at the last minute by a guidelines task force after the report was written as an addendum by the 2 committee chairs. It was randomization. It works really well with large samples, but it introduces bias if you're doing studies that randomizes 60 patients to a control arm, 60 patients to a treatment arm. The beta blocker recommendation was based by our count on 240 patients, and it was another 8,800 patients before enough data was collected to change the recommendation. So I think we need to learn how systems learn. This is shameless self-promotion. These are 2 very short and useful pieces, I think, that appeared in Lancet that I happened to author. The first is called Reality Check for Checklists, and the second is called Medicine in the Radiant City, where the Radiant City reflects Le Corbusier notions of city planning and what the anthropologist James Scott calls the aesthetic of high modernism. I believe we're operating with an aesthetic of high modernism here. So let me talk quickly about checklists and CLABSI, partly because it's the keystone study done in the state of Michigan, and I think it's a classic case of overgeneralization. I should say the surgical study that I worked on with Pranavost's group. I think there are multiple ways to reduce the rate of CLABSI. You could follow the steps of the Keystone Project. You could follow only those steps that made sense in a local context, because after all, there's no way to distinguish which parts of the CLABSI intervention contributed to the reduction of CLABSI and which did not. You could stop sending tips and peripheral blood samples to labs for culturing, treat all infections empirically, and drive your CLABSI rate down to nothing. Or you could place fewer central lines. And that brings us to what I think of as, within any learning system, the fundamental paradox of safety and quality improvement. No doubt, standardization, simplification of complex processes improve performance. Same time, that standardization and simplification encourage mindless following of routine work processes. Mindless following of routines creates conditions that are conducive to a loss of situational awareness, and a loss of situational awareness increases the likelihood of mistakes. So the better you train your people to follow routines, you need to also build in, and also while you're following those routines, think occasionally. So designed or planned social order, which it seems to me is what learning health systems are about, is schematic. It ignores essential features of any real functioning social order. This is the product of German scientific forestry, okay? German scientific forestry was adopted to make calculable the yields of wood in the king's forests, or the prince's forest. I forget what year it was, so I forget whether Germany was yet a state and whatever. But I want to ask a couple of questions. In the scientific forest, it's quite easy to see the trees, but where is the forest? Do forests have broad alleys to stroll through? Does anything about this forest suggest nature at work? Is there anything human or natural? I mean, there's much human, but is there anything natural in that picture? For Le Corbusier, a house is a machine for living, but who wants to live in a machine? And bioinformatics removes disease from individuals. I'm going to do it. And places it in population. The issue is, do we have a method for recognizing that diseases still happen to people in populations? Will the order of a learning health system recreate all the problems of the German scientific forest by refusing, in its focus on systems, to acknowledge local contexts, particular concerns of communities, and the fact that we speak broad? How many learning health systems are there at the University of Michigan? Is there one? Is it part of a national learning health system? Or does urology have a different learning health system than pathology, which is different than pediatrics? Do they talk to each other? What do we mean when we talk about a learning system? Systems don't learn squat. People learn. And what we ought to talk about is how to teach people to function in systems rather than pretending that it's the system doing the learning rather than the people that are doing the learning. Thank you.